If you're even somewhat in the know when it comes to popular film releases over the last few years, chances are you've heard of Project Hail Mary and The Martian, which both are actually adaptations of popular sci-fi novels by the author Andy Weir. Something a lot of fans of these works point to as the reason why they really enjoy them so much is because with how much we are inundated with negativity and this almost apocalyptic feeling when it comes to our day-to-day struggles in life, what we see on the news, and just in general, what is transpiring all around us, it is really refreshing for a lot of people to be able to actually see something that fills them with hope, that shows protagonists who are very inspiring, and also that shows humanity coming together for a greater good. And I do think that there is both a place for these kinds of stories, as well as stories that showcase and maybe dive further into what results in problems arising in the first place. I think consuming a lot of different kinds of stories helps us understand one another, it helps us understand the world around us, and oftentimes it helps us understand ourselves as well. Interestingly though, Andy Weir has made some comments when it comes to what he feels his role is as a writer, and also what roles he wishes other writers fulfilled that have kind of taken a lot of his fans by surprise. Additionally, this is layered with some of his recent comments about artificial intelligence, comments that go against what you typically find with a lot of writers or people that are involved in the arts in general. They have not been particularly well received, and I wanted to dive into both of these different areas. I do want to give some context though. If you kind of stumbled into this without really having a lot of awareness of Andy Weir or how he got his success or anything really about his works, I wanted to give a very quick overview because I actually do think some of what led to his success perhaps informs some of his views. A lot of the points that he's bringing up are things that I feel very passionately about, and so I thought they would be good jumping off points for further conversation. But getting into the context a little bit behind Andy Weir's success. So actually, originally, he was not somebody who was known for writing. It wasn't like he'd been writing for years and years. He'd had published novels, and then one of them finally broke through and became wildly successful. Rather, he had actually tried his hand at writing, but he ultimately just decided while he was doing his computer programming job that he would start uploading stories that would eventually go on to become The Martian, which was the main thing that kind of allowed for him to have the career he has currently as a writer. But he just started uploading chapter by chapter. He wanted to explore this idea of a person that was stranded on Mars, and if they were to face adversity, what would that look like? And he also really wanted to zero in on the science of it all because he felt that in order to actually show the adversity in a way that felt high stakes, he had to make it believable. So while he provided his own level of research, he also, in uploading chapter by chapter, had people who were reading his work as it was being created, providing their own expertise and helping him with the math and science of the story, which is a really cool collaborative effort. And it's actually not all that different from if you've ever heard of the concept of having beta readers, or just in general, authors going out of their way to research topics that they feel are important to ensure the believability of their stories, and also sometimes their characters as well. Authors' jobs are to try and tell stories that are capturing and saying something about the human condition oftentimes, but the only experiences any of us can know deeply and intimately are our own. So unless you are constantly writing an author insert as your character, you do have to branch out and research, and I think a lot of people really appreciated this effort that Andy Weir put in. As it was gaining more traction online and as more people were discovering it, it started to eventually become very popular. It was noticed by some people that have a little bit more of an influence in publishing and also in filmmaking, and then the rest is essentially history. We'll go ahead and put a pin on that for now and get into some of the recent comments that have been very surprising to a lot of people. We'll go ahead and start with some of Andy Weir's comments specifically about social commentary in books, or in television and storytelling overall. He has described himself as basically a space geek. He has considered himself to be very nerdy, and when asked about his feelings about Star Trek, specifically modern Star Trek, he is quoted as saying, "I deeply dislike social commentary. For instance, as a lifelong Star Trek fan, it's always bothered me that there is a presumed responsibility within Star Trek shows to talk about social issues. I just want to watch Romulans and the Federation shoot at each other. I'm not saying anyone else should hold my view. Many readers select books specifically for their social commentary. There's no wrong way to enjoy a book, but in the end, as a writer, I can only do my best to write books that I would enjoy reading. So for me, that means no politics. I do think it's interesting that he starts this by saying he dislikes social commentary and ends it by saying he prefers there to be no politics, because social commentary isn't necessarily always associated with politics. While I think it's hard to separate the two because so often social issues are intertwined with politics, there are still stories that are telling about personal experiences that I think most of us wouldn't categorize as political. So, for example, if you are having a deep exploration about what it's like to be in an abusive relationship, how that affects the mind, the psychological changes that occur, and how hard it is to get out of that environment, especially additionally if you have children in the equation, there are certainly people that would categorize that as social commentary, because a lot of what keeps people from leaving, even if they eventually gain this clarity about their situation, which is a very hard thing to do in the first place, but even if at some point they're like, I need to get out, sometimes there are things within society that make it very, very, very difficult. So a lot of people would categorize that as social. And again, you could argue further and further that maybe eventually this would lead to something associated with politics. Most people, though, can watch a film or read a book where this is the central focus point and not associate it with politics. And just to kind of provide a further definition of social commentary, because of the fact that he uses these interchangeably, even though they're not exactly the same. Social commentary is the act of using rhetorical means to provide commentary on social, cultural, political, or economic issues in a society. This is often done with the idea of implementing or promoting change by informing the general populace about a given problem and appealing to people's sense of justice. Social commentary can be practiced through all forms of communication, from printed form to conversations to computerized communication, including visual arts, photography, literature, public speaking, music, film, television, comic strips, and digital media. Examples range from visual art like graffiti addressing social issues, photography documenting humanitarian crises, literary and film works critiquing social injustices, dystopian fiction exploring societal control, rap music highlighting racial and economic disparities, to internet-based platforms fostering open discussion. I think it's fair to say that almost every single story in some capacity is engaging with social commentary. Even people have pointed out about Project Hail Mary, some of it is the character in the story when it comes to how they interact with another individual, rather than meeting them with hostility or fear, they instead meet them with curiosity, a thing that human beings could benefit from doing. And interestingly, Andy Weir is like, no, if you have read into that and that's your perception, that's on you. That's not what I put into it. And I'm not just saying that based off of that statement that I just read. I mean, he literally says, anything you get out of it is on you. I'm not putting anything in. He is quoted as saying, I put no politics or social commentary into my stories at all. Anyone who thinks they see something like that is reading it in on their own. I have no point to make. I have no point to make, and I'm not trying to affect the reader's opinion on anything. My sole job is to entertain, and I stick to that. I understand that he has nothing to say. In his own mind, he doesn't have anything to say. He really takes seriously the idea that all he is doing is entertaining. So if you get something out of it, that's your interpretation, but that's not what he meant. And I want to, before I provide even commentary on this idea, I want to finish reading through some of his other statements in this regard, and also some of the ways in which he's elaborated. After the first thing where he was talking about, I don't put anything into anything, I don't mean anything, I have nothing to say, there have been other interviews where people are asking for clarification. So one person was curious his clarification on social commentary, and he said, I'm not trying to change society. I'm not trying to change anyone's opinion of anything. I firmly consider myself just an entertainer. I'm just writing stories to entertain. I'm not trying to set your opinion or change your mind on anything. When you're done with one of my books, I want you to put it back on the shelf and say, that was cool, I enjoyed reading that. I'm not here to solve a pessimism epidemic. All I can do is just be me. I'm not pessimistic. I think humans are really awesome. I think technology is really awesome because technology is then put into the hands of humans who are awesome. He then extends this into some points about AI, so I'm going to save the elaboration here for when we actually open up that part of the discussion, but he also, in the part I was reading where he makes very clear, I don't have anything to say. He has more comments about social commentary. He says, I dislike it. Like, I really hate it. When I'm reading a book, I just want to be entertained, not preached at by the author. Plus, it ruins the wonder of the story if I know the author has a political or social axe to grind. I no longer speculate about all possible outcomes of the story because I know for a fact that the universe of that book will conspire to ensure that the author's political agenda is validated. I hate that. To that end, I also don't want to talk about my personal political opinions publicly. I don't want readers to even know, honestly. I don't want that in the back of their minds as they read my stuff. The interviewer asked him, hey, I respect that, but also I'm curious, you've cited a lot of very popular science fiction novels as things that you greatly enjoy or that were inspirations, and a lot of those do have a lot of social commentary, so how do you square that away? They mention some of the popular science fiction works that have had a lot to say and very clearly had a lot to say about the human condition. They mentioned Brave New World, 1984, and The Handmaid's Tale. His response to that is, yeah, I didn't really like the political message aspect of those stories. Not that I disagreed with the political point, just that I didn't like the political points being there at all. Now, those writers are so good, they make compelling and addictive stories despite the political messaging, but that's often not the case with other stories and other authors. So, I just can't fathom having the mindset of, man, I wish The Handmaid's Tale had just taken out all that social commentary. What would that story be? I am so deeply confused as to what The Handmaid's Tale would even be if you took the social commentary part out. And I'll even return to my previous example of if there is a story that's meant to showcase how difficult it is to get out of an abusive relationship, there are a lot of things that you can add into that are not necessarily what people would expect. For example, you can showcase what it's like if you have no safety net, if you don't have family members who will support you or somewhere you can go. You can talk about how you are afraid that because the person maybe hasn't done enough where you would be able to get a restraining order against them, or you would be able to have them imprisoned, and thus, if you have kids, your kids would be safe from them. Instead, you now have to deal with the fact that you're going to see your kids half of the time, or maybe even less than that, and that you now have to leave your children alone with that person. Is it better if you just are around so you can keep track? All these things that are important things for us to have conversations about and to consider. If that is a book that you're writing and you release it and Andy Weir's like, ugh, I wish you left out all the parts about like the abusive relationship and stuff, then I would have maybe liked it. Yeah, no, some books are about problems. Some books, that is what they're focused on, and part of how we come to see each other, understand each other, gain more insight and knowledge into what other people's lives are like, because we can't know anything other than our own, and how we're able to learn about it is through books, through other things too, like actually having conversations with other people. But there are some experiences where you will never interact with a person that has a certain experience. So the only access you have to understanding that experience and understanding the world around you a little bit better is through works of fiction, documentaries, or even just movies or other forms of art that are able to express that to you. This idea of, oh, geez, I don't want to have to think about, like, bad stuff, though. I just want the pew-pew more often, please, please. I don't want to have to think about this. It is shocking, frankly. There's also a distinction that's important to make, which is that there are some works where the thematic elements are present, but they are also delivered in a way that is unbearable. The author seems to not trust your level of intelligence, and they beat you over and over and over on the head with the said themes. That is very different from the themes being present and explored really, really well. Also, even if the themes are explored well, and even if you agree with them, that does not necessarily mean that you're going to like the book. Maybe you couldn't stand the characters, the writing style, the tone, the voice. There are so many factors that go into the subjectivity of a work, and as a result, I don't think it is as simple as I don't like when there is commentary because I don't like when I'm being preached to. It's predictable. There are a lot more nuances to this, and he has had multiple instances where he could have provided clarification. He's been given opportunities to provide clarification, and he has never brought up these points within the conversation. And that is unfortunate because Yeah, there are works where I really like the themes, but I don't like the book, or I really like the themes, but I didn't feel like the author trusted my level of intelligence, and at some point it was irritating or it was annoying. And those are all important parts of this conversation, parts that I wish that he had dived into at least at some point in any of these interviews. Now, there are certain things within this that I can understand, and I want to elaborate on those things. So, when he was talking about how I don't want my readers to know my political beliefs, I would prefer they didn't have that as they were going into my works. There are a couple reasons why I don't necessarily think this is always a bad thing. For example, if you want your book to resonate with people, to have individuals wrestle with it, if they don't have any preconceived notions before going in, it increases the chances of them having that. Now, it's hard to remove what other people's interpretations are from the equation. However, you have a higher chance of actually meeting the art where it is if you maybe don't have something in the back of your mind. Essentially, if you leave your bias at the door, you can better actually meet the art and engage with it critically and honestly. I think that that makes sense if that is part of the reason you don't want to have your politics known necessarily. It also makes sense to have this mindset if you don't feel that you articulate your feelings very well, if you don't personally think that you are the most knowledgeable about things, and thus you don't want to potentially influence people, or maybe you don't want to perpetuate this idea that we should be seeking out guidance from people who aren't known experts. And so you kind of remove yourself from the equation, but you feel that you do have a lot to say, and you do it best when you can have a heavily researched story, when you have the time to write out dialogue and symbolism, and let the story breathe, let it feel like it's not just a talking point. It's not something with a character limit on social media. It's something that really allows us to see people better. If you have that mindset and that's why you prefer not to share, also, that makes sense. And there's also the point that a lot of authors recognize that they are an ever-changing person, and if they say something, that exists in perpetuity. They aren't going to be able to scrape that or remove that from the internet, and they recognize that there are areas where they need to learn more. Or maybe they recognize they have a huge influence and they would hate to lead people in the wrong direction. They don't want to be used by political figures, so they choose to just kind of opt out of that, and then they just write stories. And also, not every story is political, as we have discussed already. One additional factor that I think is a very mature way of looking at how what you say outside of your work might influence your work is that, especially in science fiction and fantasy communities, fandoms can be pretty intense, and if you ever are quoted saying something about what you intended, what you meant, what a character meant, anything like that, any person who reviews the book or discusses the book who says something even a little bit different from that will be met with the fandom saying, no, here's why you are wrong, because this is what the author said. This results in there being very limited options for what people can interpret in the stories, and also it really limits the ability for conversation and for people to share their different takes, because there is this kind of natural human reaction of, well, I have the author backing up my interpretation, so therefore my interpretation is more correct than your interpretation. And we could go into a whole conversation about how, yes, things are up for interpretation, but some people's interpretations feel like they're not rooted in any evidence, or perhaps maybe they don't have very strong media literacy, and thus their interpretations are weaker when it comes to actually pulling from what the story itself says. That's a whole other conversation, but sometimes people are basing their feelings off of what's right there in front of them in the text, and other people will say, nuh-uh, the author said this though. And I can understand if an author wants to limit those kinds of interactions. I think that is something that is quite responsible of the author to do. And it's hard to do because when you see people having interpretations that you're like, oh, that's not what I meant, or I didn't want people to get that impression, or, well, I guess that's fine, but also, no. I can understand where you'd want to intervene and be like, well, no, this is what I meant actually. And I think that this statement here, I feel falls in line with that. You don't want to limit what people get out of your story. So I can understand that point. The idea that social commentary is exhausting, or that, as he puts it, he knows for a fact that the universe of the book will conspire to ensure that author's political agenda, that is, I think, just one pendulum swing to the next. You either think that it needs to be devoid of it, or you think that it's going to result in it being exceptionally predictable, which I'm glad that the interviewer pressed him on this, because he did concede, like, well, like, sometimes they're really good, but that's just because some authors are really good. And really good authors who genuinely seek to portray things in a realistic manner are going to aim to do that, which means they're going to have characters that are flawed, they're going to have characters that are imperfect, and also not every author who has something to say is going to have the world conspire to push their political agenda, as he puts it. Sometimes they're just going to show things as they are, so that you wouldn't actually even know what the author thinks. I'm going to once again return to this scenario where we're talking about an abusive environment. I think most people would hope that the takeaway from that story is like, oh, I hope that the person gets out. I hope that they are safe. But just because the point you're trying to make is we have systems in place that make it very difficult for people to leave abusive relationships, and those get harder and harder when you have children in the equation, or when you don't have social safety nets involved, or when you are isolated as a result of various things within culture that try to tell you that you need to do everything on your own. And also maybe you have the shame of, if you get divorced, then all of a sudden you're seen as less than, you didn't work hard enough at your relationship. So that's social commentary, because you're talking about society. So within that, most people, I think, can agree we want the victim of the abuse to get out. We also want their children to be safe, and we want some kind of happily ever after for them. But I don't know what's going to happen in this scenario. Maybe the victim will murder their abuser. Maybe the victim themselves will unfortunately face something really horrific. Maybe, very sadly, they will be led to believe that it's all in their head. The horrible things that have been said to them, they'll start to believe those things, and then they'll stay as a result. There are a lot of different outcomes that can come out of this. I think that based off of how he's wording his statement here of like, oh, I just know it's going to conspire to ensure the author's political agenda is validated. In this example I'm giving, the political agenda is abuse is bad, which is weird if you don't want to have that in your stories. But that might seem like a stretch of like, well, he's not saying that. That's an extreme. But again, the interviewer asked him The Handmaid's Tale, and he's like, yeah, it was good despite that stuff, though. And at some point, you're like, I think we can agree that if you're going to use the term social commentary to describe what you hate in stories, then you have to recognize you are essentially saying, don't ever say anything that makes people have to acknowledge the wrongs that other people have committed. I don't like it. It's fine if you like it, but I don't like it. I don't want to see it. I don't want to write it. I don't really want other writers to do that. I hate it. It makes the story weaker. Returning once again to one of his other quotes where he says, I'm not here to solve a pessimism epidemic. All I can do is be me, and I'm not pessimistic. I think humans are awesome. I don't think that having social commentary that highlights issues within our societies is pessimism. It's reality, and people addressing that and addressing that in works of art is powerful, and I would argue necessary in order for us to progress, at the very least, faster than we would if all we ever cared about was entertainment. And I respect genuinely that he doesn't feel that these are the stories he's meant to write. And I want to be very clear that entertainment is valuable in its own right. Sometimes you don't want to read about this fill-in-the-blank thing that is awful. Sometimes you just need to relax. Sometimes you just need to have fun. And sometimes you just need these things that it seems Andy Weir is in favor of, which is these sorts of stories that fill you with hope in your fellow man and humanity overall, and that we can just come together. And if only we come together, which we can actually, because he's an optimistic guy, so we can come together. Let's do it. Those stories are important too, and sometimes you really need those. I don't want anybody to get the impression that I am saying one is much more valuable at all times than the other. We need both kinds of stories. While he did say that he's not asking for anybody else to share his view, I still think that it is something you have to be mindful of, that when you're saying you hate it, you are saying basically it's going to be contrived. When you're saying these sorts of things, you are at the very least providing fuel for people who are going to use this viewpoint nefariously. And I know that you can't necessarily hold him responsible for how somebody takes his words, and you could argue twist them out of context, but I don't really think it'd be out of context. There are plenty of times where people will decide that something is social commentary because of the fact that we have this sort of perceived neutrality that is not rooted in anything real. So to elaborate on what I mean by that, the gaming community, unfortunately, as somebody who loves video games, this is not my favorite thing about being a gamer. The gaming community makes very clear that women are inherently political or social. Their existence in games, specifically as the protagonists, and very specifically if they're not extremely sexualized and super generically hot, if they exist within a video game, it is a political message. It is social commentary. So Andy Weir's stories are not viewed this way because his protagonists are falling under the umbrella of perceived neutrality. There is nothing necessarily offensive to a lot of people about his protagonists, but the second you change the protagonist, it will be perceived as commentary because some people's existence is perceived as political. So, with the gamer example, there is a video game I'm a big fan of called Ghost of Tsushima, one of my favorite games. The art direction is fantastic, the gameplay is fun, voice acting is incredible, a lot of artistic decisions with that are chef's kiss, so good, and also the storyline is kind of combating the very, very difficult decision of turning your back on your principles versus holding true to those principles, even if that means other people will suffer and die. And it's kind of old versus new. And what do you do when you have to really reconcile with these things because there's an outside threat affecting you and your people? So really, really wonderful writing all around. Fantastic story. Then they made another one called Ghost of Yote. Takes place roughly 300 years later, follows the character Atsu, who was, when she was very young, her family was murdered, and now all she seeks, basically, is to avenge those that she lost. And when it was announced that the protagonist was going to be a woman, you would have comment sections flooded with people insisting that they are having this agenda forced onto them. You have men saying that they don't want to have to imagine themselves as a woman. And you have a lot of other people that were insisting that it's somehow some kind of commentary simply because she isn't somebody that they would want to have sex with because they didn't make her generically video game level hot like they did Eve from Stellar Blade. So you had a lot of people that very openly just straight up said, I think that this is a political agenda because women. And even Andy Weir's stories, he sees them as these optimistic, hope-filled works. But if you changed his protagonist, then there would be a lot of people that would naturally just decide that it was political, and he doesn't see it because he thinks that his stories are absent of that. But part of why he doesn't see it is because his protagonists fall under this perceived neutrality. You make his protagonist a woman, maybe you can get away with it. But you make his protagonist a queer person, a Muslim person, you make them a different race, and there are going to be other conversations that are brought into the equation, even though you could have the exact same story that says nothing else. It's just that the protagonist is different, and you will have people immediately decide that it is social commentary. I would be curious to know how he would acknowledge this, if he would agree or disagree, or if he would even want to engage in this. And maybe he would think that I am falling into what he labels as the pessimism epidemic because he thinks people are awesome. And I also think people are awesome. There are a lot of stories where random acts of kindness from strangers or people come together that are exceptionally moving. They'll move me to tears because there is something about when you see people come together that it really hits something in us. It strikes a chord in a good way. And I appreciate that. And I think you need people in society that maybe lean a little bit pessimistic and people that lean a little bit optimistic. And then a lot of us are somewhere in the middle. I think we do want to come together because we need those people that are going to keep it real and that are honest, and then you need those people that are like, we can do it though, we can do it. So we need the mix. I'm not trying to argue that pessimism or optimism, that one kind of person is better than the other, but I also think we need to be mindful of what we're labeling as pessimism. I don't think it's pessimism to acknowledge the world around us and want to tell stories about it. There's an article that I will read more of in just a moment, but it's going to transition us into the AI conversation, which we'll get to in just a moment. But there's one last little piece of this part of the conversation that I wanted to mention. So it talks about how he has this optimism that is tied to how he has seen human beings handle something like the pandemic. So he points to the pandemic as evidence that Project Hail Mary style global collective action is possible. He acknowledges the confusion and mismanagement, but he sees it ultimately as a good example of the world working together to confront a crisis. He explains if it were not for the pandemic, it would probably be 20 or 30 years of slow, methodical research before the vaccines were being used, but within 1 year, we got it working. So again, I appreciate people pointing out aspects of a crisis that showed the good of humanity. I also think it's important to acknowledge, without this kind of hand waving, like, yeah, I know stuff, there's like mismanagement and everything, but also like, aren't humans great because we like came up with the vaccine really fast? I think genuine observations about a lot of the wrongdoing that occurred are still good things to do. So yes, while it was great that people were able to come together so that we could provide vaccines to a lot of individuals, there were so many things that happened that were also terrible. So for example, obviously a lot of people were out of work. Some people had just finally started businesses, and then those immediately fell through and collapsed because of the timing of it all, which is awful. And there was no way to get that back. They lost their savings. There are people that couldn't afford to live where they were living. And even though there were things put in place to help, so for example, money was given to landlords so that they wouldn't have to charge the people that were renters. Despite that, a lot of times they evicted those people anyway, and then they used the money to renovate so that then they could get wealthier people to live in those buildings. And then also, just personal anecdotal experience, a lot of people in the healthcare industry let my father down. They were not there for him when he needed them. He was high risk. They were dismissive. They didn't do their jobs very thoroughly. He suffered immensely, and he died as a result of it. And as somebody who was his caretaker at that time, it was terrible. It was awful. In the same way, though, that I don't blame somebody who wanted to focus on the global good, you could call it, that maybe you saw occurring, I also think it's fine to focus on the negatives that occurred. And I'm going to kind of take a pin out of what we were talking about before with how he came to have his success. His success was in part because of the camaraderie of his fellow man. So it makes sense that he would want to focus on those sorts of things because it was a great influence in his life. It was a great good in his life. It can be a great good in so many people's lives. And I don't blame him for wanting to highlight that and give other people hope and say, hey, it is possible. We can come together and do great things. It's happened for me. I think that's really wonderful. But I also think it's notable that when he does talk about examples of people coming together, like in this particular instance where he talks about the pandemic, he has a tendency to focus on crises that don't have the most obvious, you could say, quote unquote, villain in the scenario. So there are some instances where there are oppressive governments. There are some instances where there are really horrible working conditions. There are some instances where people, they choose to not get healthcare because they know they can't afford it, and then they die. And those sorts of situations, you can point to specific individuals, but the only thing I think he could have pointed to as less blameless would be if he mentioned natural disasters and how we come through those together, which even in those scenarios, there are people that try to take advantage. So sometimes you have people that if there's a wildfire, want to buy out that land so they can build over it because they know the people that previously lived there now can't afford to rebuild. And that's disgusting. That's a thing that can happen. So you do have people that are predatory in nature through those situations. But mostly, if there is some kind of earthquake or wildfire or tsunami or something awful, yeah, a lot of human beings come together to do some good, and you can't really be mad at the ocean or something. You can't like be mad at that. And that's kind of what he does in his stories, is he focuses on things where there isn't any need for justice because he's not interested in exploring those things, and that's fine. It's fine that he doesn't want to explore those things. I do think, though, it would be nice if he was a little more mature about how he discussed what his preferences are from other stories. He talks about them in a way where it is essentially saying like, ugh, I just know it's going to be predictable. There are only a handful of authors that can write good stories despite making me think about all of these really challenging things about humans and the societies that we live in. Maybe you disagree with me, maybe you disagree with him, maybe you lie somewhere in the middle, but I wanted to segue now into discussing what he has had to say about AI. It says, in Weir's mind, AI will eventually be capable of writing, quote, more entertaining, compelling, and exciting stories than any human, drawing from the vast catalog of literature and piecing together the parts people enjoy most. Beyond that, he predicts art will, quote, shift away from collective entertainment to a personal form. In other words, Weir thinks AI will be widely used to create stories tailored to an individual's known preferences, and it'll happen, quote, probably within our lifespans. Dismisses the idea that people will miss human artists, and then returning to the other interview he did where he was clarifying what he had to say about social commentary. So to kind of segue us, I'll return to what he was starting to say and then finish it out. So he had been talking about how he's not pessimistic. I think humans are really awesome. I think technology is really awesome because technology is then put into the hands of humans who are awesome. People are afraid of AI, but AI can do things no human can. I'm like, so can a forklift. If I give you a hammer, you could build a house or you could murder someone. There's nothing about the hammer that does it, and most people use hammers to build houses. So I'm not afraid of technology because I'm not afraid of my fellow humanity. I'm optimistic that way. I feel compelled in this scenario to point out, not because of pessimism, but because of reality, that people within your fellow humanity are using AI to undress women and children on a regular basis. This whole, well, the hammer can be used to build a house or murder someone is already not a very good analogy, because if you stole the hammer in the first place, then you probably shouldn't have that hammer. But people like to forget that the hammer, aka the artificial intelligence in this particular scenario, was built upon the theft of so many non-consenting artists, whether we're talking about visual art, whether we're talking about books. Most people did not want to contribute to this. They didn't have any say in this. It was done without their permission, which if you wanted to tell a story about corporations and how they have managed to get involved in the government so that they could deregulate all of these sorts of things, I don't know what genre ever we could explore those sorts of topics within. I do think it's important to note, though, what are the kinds of things that Andy Weir thinks we should be using AI for? He does talk about breakthroughs when it comes to medicine, which, hey, I'm all for that. Also, though, in order for that to happen, we have to continue to ensure that funding is given to people who are doing research for these sorts of things, not just a bunch of money given to generative AI. There are differences, and we want people who are trying to, as an example, cure cancer to be able to continue to be funded so that they could then use any technology that comes their way responsibly and actually know what they're doing, which I guess is social commentary to even bring up that sort of thing. But what is Andy Weir using AI for? Andy Weir uses AI, as he puts it, when he gets bored, to have it make images of his wife in strange outfits and time periods. He shows her as a prehistoric cave woman, and he says that she liked that one, so she gave him permission to post it. And I gotta say, hire an artist. If you want to see what your wife would look like in different time periods and in different outfits, hire somebody. Or try it. That could be really funny. It would be really funny, and it wouldn't be engaging in the theft of other artists. I don't understand. I especially don't like this mindset of like, well, I got it in just under the wire, because it's basically like, well, it's not going to affect me, so, you know, it's fine, and other humans, they'll figure it out. In conclusion, there is always a place for human-made art and different kinds of stories, whether those stories be hope-filled or reflecting accurate injustices and hardships that we face in our lives. I am very curious to know, though, were you surprised by some of this? Did you already know about some of this? How have you been processing what you got out of his stories versus what he says about stories? Just in general, if you have anything else that you'd like to add, feel free to do so. If you have an interest in looking at the various different interviews that I was pulling from, I'll have those linked. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.